have never seen a video nasty. I wouldn't. I have far too much.
How can you judge on a video nasty? You've never seen one.
Look, if somebody tells me, as we get these reports in from Europe, from America, and from this country, that a particular video nasty contains that, and that, I actually don't need to see visually what I know is in that film.
Welcome to episode 50 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are returning to our roots with one film from Francoist Spain and another from the world of the Italian giallo. Both of these feature multiple murderers in pretty much every sense of the term. Both were released outside of their countries of origin under various different and incredibly exploitative titles, and both ended up being successfully prosecuted in the UK under the Obscene Publications Act as so-called video nasties. First up, we have The Week of the Killer from 1972, which was released outside of Spain under the titles Cannibal Man and alternatively The Apartment on the 13th Floor. Both of these English-language titles are incredibly misleading, it has to be said, as there is little to no cannibalism in the movie, and the apartment connection is tenuous at best. It was directed by Eloy de la Iglesia and stars Vicente Parra, Emma Cohen, Eusebio Poncela, Vicky Lagos, and Charly Bravo. Then we travel to Italy for the second film in our series directed by Mario Bava. This is The Ecology of a Crime from 1971, which was released outside of Italy with multiple titles including A Bay of Blood, Twitch of the Death Nerve, Carnage, Bloodbath, and Last House on the Left Part 2. Though for this episode I will be referring to it as A Bay of Blood, as this is the title by which it is most widely known in the UK, at least. This stars Luigi Pistilli, Claudine Auger, Claudio Camaso, Laura Betti, and Anna Maria Rosati. Along the way, we'll be discussing the life and career of Eloy de la Iglesia, continuing the journey of the career of Mario Bava, the influence of A Bay of Blood on the American slasher movie, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, though, I'm just going to list the main sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, but all sources will be listed or linked in the show notes. So, when discussing The Week of the Killer, I have referred to the book Spanish Horror Film by Antonio Lázaro-Reboll, and interviews and special features on the Blu-ray edition of the film, which was released by Severin. I've also referenced interviews and articles on the websites terrorweekend.com, elconfidencial.com, kgfilms.com, europapress.es, lpay.com, and also a paper titled Subversive Effects of Perversion, Sexuality and Social Construction in the Cannibal Man by Carlos Gómez, and this was uploaded to the website academia.edu. And when discussing A Bay of Blood, I have referred to the books So Deadly, So Perverse, Volume 1 by Troy Howarth, The Haunted World of Mario Bava, also by Troy Howarth, and Italian Horror Cinema, edited by Stefano Basciera and Russ Hunter. I've also referenced interviews, extras, and commentaries on the Blu-ray special edition of the film released by Severin Films, and also interviews on the websites davinotti.com, sdanger.com, and cinepugno.home.blog. And as usual, I've also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the film's directors, cast, and crew. And we're going to be jumping straight into our first film this week, which is The Week of the Killer from 1972. And as I mentioned, this stars Vicente Parra, Emma Cohen, Eusebio Poncela, Vicky Lagos, and Charly Bravo, and was directed by Eloy de la Iglesia. Like many directors who produced films during the so-called golden age of Spanish horror, Eloy de la Iglesia is not strictly a horror director, but instead an artist who utilized the genre during the rule of General Franco as a means to express his own political and social beliefs. Across the early 1970s, Iglesia, no relation to other podcast favourite Alex, directed 4 genre pictures that are sometimes categorized as horror adjacent. But of these, it is only The Week of the Killer, with its steady descent into madness and violence, that can really be termed a horror film, to the extent that it eventually became caught up in the UK video nasties debacle of the mid-1980s. But even then, this was probably less to do with its content and more down to the exploitative English-language title of Cannibal Man, which earned it unfair comparisons with the wave of Italian cannibal films that were released on home video at around the same time. And it has to be said that this retitling did neither the film nor potential viewers many favours. Although it is, for its time, remarkably brutal, anybody expecting similar atrocities to those of Cannibal Holocaust or Cannibal Ferox would have been highly disappointed, finding instead a politically charged character study of a man crushed by the establishment, as well as, being blunt, possibly one of the most queer-coded thrillers of the early 1970s. And I use the term coded here with some degree of caution. The sexual subtext in the movie is so blatant that one wonders how the hell it managed to get past the censors at all, even with the numerous cuts that were imposed on it by the Franco regime. But while it might not really be a video nasty, what it does have though, for anyone who has yet to see it, is a particularly unpleasant piece of cinema verite footage from inside a slaughterhouse, which, while making perfect sense in the context of the film, is deeply disturbing to behold. And so, as I advised at the end of last week's episode, anyone who's vegetarian, vegan, or indeed relatively squeamish might want to approach this film with a great deal of caution. We explored the golden age of Spanish horror extensively back in episode 1, and in that episode we discussed that one way in which directors managed to get around censorship of the time was to code their films as foreign, setting their narratives outside of Spain with non-Spanish stars and often as co-productions with countries like Italy, Germany or France. But Eloy de la Iglesia was an exception to this, setting his films firmly in Spain of the 1970s, an artistic decision that led to no end of problems with the Spanish authorities. And this was exacerbated further by the social and political subtext he began to explore in his work. Themes that included state corruption, class oppression, and sexual repression, which reflected not only the political climate of the time, but also his own experiences as a gay man living under a nationalist dictatorship. In an interview quoted in the book Spanish Horror Film by Antonio Lázaro-Reboll, he explained his preoccupations as follows, quote, "I tell my obsessions through a prism of repression, my own repression, my way of expressing myself in life, and an institutionalized repression related to my surroundings, which can be seen in the way we communicate with each other. I am conscious that I live in a society full of repressed people, and that within this society I belong to an elite which is even more repressed. In my films, this repression manifests itself in an aggressive manner." End quote. Eloy de la Iglesia was born in 1944 in the Basque country of northern Spain, although he was brought up in Madrid. Interested in film from an early age, he attempted to enroll at the Spanish Film School in Madrid, but was rejected as, at the time, he was underage. And so he instead travelled to Paris, where he studied at the Institute for Advanced Cinematographic Studies, and then returned to Spain, where he studied philosophy and literature at the University of Madrid. But by the time that he reached the third year, he realised that he wanted to dedicate himself to film, theatre and television, and so he abandoned his studies. At this point, he began writing, rather surprisingly given his later works, children's theatre, before moving on to work as a scriptwriter and director of children's TV for Radio Televisión Española in Barcelona. By the time that he was 20, he had already scripted and produced many works for television, and at the age of 22, he directed his first feature film, a movie for children called Fantasia 3, which was released in 1966. Fantasia 3, or Fantasy 3, is an adaptation of three children's stories: The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen, The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum, and The Devil with Three Golden Hairs by the Brothers Grimm. I've been able to find very little information about it other than the year of its release, and it's now considered something of an oddity in his filmography. Soon after this, he entered national service, and during this time he wrote the screenplay for what would become his second feature, a thriller called Something Bitter in the Mouth, which would be released in 1968. This marked his departure away from children's entertainment and into more decidedly adult fare, and told the story of a young man visiting relatives at Christmas, only to find himself the unwilling object of romantic attention from three of the women in the house. Described as part psychological thriller and part erotic drama, on its release in 1969 it was only screened in Barcelona, though it would gain a wider release 3 years later, following the success of his fourth movie, the psychological thriller The Glass Ceiling, which was released in 1972. This film also saw him begin to tentatively explore some of the socio-political themes that would come to dominate his later movies, and as a result also marked the first of many problems that he would experience with the Franco government, something that he would also experience with his follow-up, Boxing Ring, released a year later in 1969. This film tells the story of two young boxers whose careers are heavily manipulated by their manager, and it starred American actor Dean Salmier and Cuban boxing champion Jose Maria Prada. Exploring corruption and the darker side of the boxing world, it is now seen as an analogy for Francoist Spain, and it was censored to such an extent that Iglesia would later disown it, the only one of his films that he would distance himself from completely. Dean Salmier would go on to star in Iglesia's next project, and the first of the director's films that would be a commercial success. This was the thriller The Glass Ceiling, released in 1971, which co-starred the popular Spanish actress Carmen Sevilla and Patti Shepard, an American expat who would appear in several cult Euro horror movies, including The Werewolf vs. the Vampire Woman in 1971 and the Italian giallo My Dear Killer in 1972. Part Spanish giallo, part Rear Window, and part Gaslight, this film tells the story of a lonely housewife, Martha, played by Sevilla, who, while her husband is away, begins to suspect that her upstairs neighbour, played by Patti Shepard, may have murdered her husband. Featuring Salmier as a landlord and artist who spends much of the movie shirtless and sweating over a fire, this film introduces a homoerotic subtext as well as a theme of voyeurism, both of which would be amplified in Iglesias' subsequent thrillers. It's not a perfect film by any means, but it is entertaining and also features some interesting subtext on the sexual politics of Spanish society of the time. At around this time, Iglesia joined the Communist Party, something that would certainly not have endeared him to the anti-communist Franco regime, and his films began to reflect his political beliefs more explicitly. And this is something that would cause even more issues with the censors and the establishment when he came to co-write and direct his next film, The Week of the Killer, otherwise known as Cannibal Man. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so if you have yet to see the movie and don't mind seeing bulls and cows being slaughtered for real, now is the time to press pause and come back once you have. The Week of the Killer, which, as its name suggests, is structured around the days of the week, focuses on a worker called Marcos. He lives with his brother in a small house that stands in an isolated lot that is being redeveloped to make way for luxury apartments. It's clear from the outset that he has issues connecting with people. We are told from very early dialogue that he should by now be married, and when we meet his girlfriend Paula, we learn that their relationship is being kept hidden from her family. And this is firstly because of a considerable age difference between the two, and also, one assumes, due to his status as a worker in a meat processing plant. Even Nestor, the man with whom he will eventually form a very strange relationship, says that Marcos always seems indifferent, to which Marcos responds, quote, I guess it's just the way I'm made." End quote. On Sunday, Marcos and Paula go on a date and are thrown out of a taxi by the driver, who objects to their kissing in the back seat. A fight breaks out and Marcos, attempting to defend both he and Paula, hits the driver in the head with a rock, killing him pretty much instantly. The two make their escape, but on Monday the newspapers are full of the story, and Paula insists that Marcos turns himself into the police. After initially trying to dissuade her, he kills her too, and then hides her body in his bedroom. The next day, on Tuesday, his brother, who has been away working as a truck driver, returns home and discovers Paula's body. He too insists that Marcos hands himself in, and so Marcos kills him as well. As the week continues, Marcos commits more murders to avoid being discovered, while at the same time striking up a relationship with a wealthy young man called Nestor, who lives in one of the apartments that overlooks his house. As the narrative progresses, Nestor inserts himself more and more into Marcos' situation, until it eventually transpires that he has been watching the murders all along from his apartment terrace, and has even been giving Marcos subtle clues as to how he can evade detection. Were this all there was to the narrative, The Week of the Killer would be little more than a body count movie, with not much to elevate it above your average slasher. But within the threads of this remarkably simple story, Iglesia weaves significant social commentary, including themes of class, gentrification, industrialization, government corruption, and sexuality. Iglesia once said that this was truly the first of his films in which he made his ideological concerns explicit, and so it's little wonder that the film was subject to 64 cuts by the censor before it was released in Spain. Even before production, the screenplay was rejected several times by the authorities, whose approval was needed before filming could begin. Initially submitted under the admittedly gruesome title of Genuine Meat Broth, which is still an improvement on Cannibal Man, it was immediately rejected for being quote-unquote an accumulation of gruesomeness. The censorship body, which was largely comprised of conservative bureaucrats, state-approved critics, and the Catholic Church, insisted that for the film to be viable, multiple changes had to be made to the narrative. They were particularly offended by the film's general bad taste, that originally Marcos would escape from punishment, and especially the character of Nestor, who they noted was, quote, a character with a marked homosexual personality, end quote. A month later, Iglesia submitted a new version under the title The Week of the Killer, which again was rejected on the grounds that it was too gruesome, that the dialogue and situations were too risque, that the erotic elements needed to be toned down considerably, and that the character of the, quote, sexually ambiguous Nestor, end quote, were still unacceptable. In the end, another and final version of the screenplay, with many alterations made, was deemed acceptable for the film to go into production. But even then, Iglesia and his co-writer Antonio Foss had to include a disclaimer that Nestor was in no way at all a gay man, which is pretty hard to believe when you see the final movie. This disclaimer said, quote, even though we believe that Nestor as a character is perfectly defined in the script, we are adding this note to avoid any possible confusion and misrepresentations concerning the behavior of said character. Nestor's curiosity and interest in approaching and becoming intimate with Marcos is purely and simply motivated by being involved in the most exciting game a person of a certain intellectual level can find himself in, a murder intrigue. He can talk, walk alongside, or get to know a man who has killed without him suspecting that he who seems like a friend knows all along that he is a murderer. There is no other interest in their relationship whatsoever. End quote. Even then, after production, the film was labelled as severely dangerous, and it sat on the shelf in Spain until 1974. At this point, it was finally screened with an ending that Iglesia denounced in later interviews, saying that for the character of Marcos to turn himself in was an imposed betrayal of the character. But ironically enough, if anything, this new and state-imposed ending just highlights the gay subtext even further, so perhaps the censors should have left well alone. The character of Nestor may well have been framed in the disclaimer simply as a thrill-seeking rich man, but the nature of the relationship on screen would indicate otherwise. Nestor and Marcus first interact in the movie long before he would have witnessed any murders, with Nestor saying that as they lived near to each other, he had hoped that they would become better friends, and it's certainly implied that he has watched Marcos masturbating through his binoculars. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, to call this film queer-coded would be an understatement, particularly the scene where Nestor and Marcus go swimming in a nearby pool and then shower together under a fountain, all accompanied by a haunting and romantic musical score. And it is through their friendship that Marcos finds an escape from the various oppressions of Catholic and Francoist Spain, suggesting that his violence is as much to do with a repression of his own sexuality as it is to do with anything else. Their relationship has caused some concern for modern viewers, most notably the writer Phil Hardy in the Auger Film Encyclopedia of Horror, who felt that it, quote, ends up reinforcing the notion that homosexuals have a special affinity with psychotic killers, end quote, which is certainly one way to look at it, but which I believe rather misses the point. Towards the end of the movie, when he realizes that Nestor has been watching him commit the murders all along, Marcos finds himself unable to kill him, indicating that within their relationship he has discovered, far too late, the nature of his own identity, and also suggesting that, had he been free to express who he was all along, the killings might never have happened. As a result, this is perhaps one of the few horror movies where, despite the gruesome acts committed by the protagonist, one cannot help but feel pity for the tragedy of his life. And this would appear to be reinforced by Iglesia's assertion in later interviews that each of Marcos's victims are not so much people as the embodiment of the various forms of oppression under which he finds himself: reactionary moral aggression, family authority, domestic responsibility, and so on and so on. But the character of Nestor represents much more than an opportunity for queer subtext and homoerotic swimming scenes. He is also, as a wealthy man, a representative of the class struggle which Iglesia is also exploring in the film. His dog is named, with no hint of irony, Trotsky, after the Russian revolutionary politician and political theorist, and the dialogue between the two men has significant double meaning. At one point, when Nestor says that the local dogs that roam the neighborhood are too hungry to cause any real damage, Marcos simply tells him, "You never know. There's nothing more powerful than hunger," to which Nestor responds, "You sound like a demagogue." Class struggle is a running theme throughout the movie, and even the structure of the film, set against the typical working week, punctuated by the blare of the factory siren, indicates some commentary about the nature of labour. In addition, Marcos's small house is gradually being encroached upon by gentrification and redevelopment, changes that were part of a wider transformation in Spain at the time, which saw communities being divided in the name of modernity. And this is thrown into sharp relief when we finally see the inside of Nestor's apartment. With its luxurious furnishings and walls full of artwork, it is a direct contrast to Marcos's little house, which is crumbling and decorated with pin-up posters. The chasm between the rich and the poor is also highlighted in the way that Nestor and Marcos are handled very differently by the police. Out drinking one night, they are asked for their identification, and while the police initially appear somewhat menacing when Nestor tells them that he has left his at home, they soon change their tune when they realize that he is one of the wealthy people from the new apartment blocks. Instead of arresting him, they just respond with a smile and tell him to just remember it next time. In an interview on the Blu-ray release of the film from Severin, the writer Sheila Rowan Legg takes this one step further, saying that in the film, Nestor is allowed to exist as a gay man because he has money, his wealth then offering him another privilege that Marcos can never experience. That the director has more than a little contempt for authority figures is also made quite apparent during the scene where Marcos is told that he has been given a promotion at work. This promotion is to operate new machines, which are so precise and so perfect that, quote, you could say that the brains of 100 wise men have been placed inside them, end quote. This, of course, highlights the so-called progress of mechanization, and is also something which might stir a nerve or two in the modern viewer in these times of artificial intelligence and the laying off of workers in the name of quote-unquote progress. And that this rousing monologue is nothing more than corporate bullshit is made quite apparent later, when it is revealed that Marcos's years of experience have qualified him to do little more than shovel meat from a wheelbarrow and into a metal chute, and then repeat the process over and over again. More telling, though, is the other rationale for the boss's decision, which is declared in the very same speech. At this point, we learn that Marcos's mother was also a worker at the plant, and that she died in a terrible industrial accident. And this is something that the boss uses not as an opportunity to express sympathy or empathy or regret, but instead as a moment to speak proudly for the way in which the company honoured her death, saying, quote, not only have we taken into account the 15 years you've been at service of the company, but to this we have added the ever-present memory of your mother, a great operator. Your mother, a lifetime of complete dedication to this society until the unfortunate and unpredictable accident ended her life. It's true that the company at the time not only paid what the guild union foresee for such cases, but also paid its own splendid compensation and even paid for a quarter-page obituary in the ABC newspaper. Go, son, go to the machine and let no one say you are not worthy of it. End quote. Iglesias' animosity is further compounded with the dialogue that closes the sequence, with the boss bringing his insincere platitudes to an abrupt end with a sharp, let the next one in, to his secretary. This scene reveals multiple aspects about the society that Iglesia is portraying and also, albeit unsubtly, rallying against. Marcos represents a generation of workers that seem caught in a cycle of despair, no hope, no opportunities, and no real future, forced to work in the factory which caused his mother's incredibly violent death in a role that ultimately will be replaced by a machine. That his mother's death was violent is certain. It is spelled out with absolutely no empathy and perhaps a little glee by Marcos's co-worker, who recalls the incident as he shows our protagonist how to work the new machine, saying, quote, I was close to her the day of the accident. See, moments earlier she was so normal, so fresh, and suddenly she turned into a human torch, running like hell. She didn't run, she flew. She tripped over a stool, and the stool burned down. She grabbed onto a shelf, and the shelf looked like a burning log. Thank goodness she didn't make it to the acid decanters, because the factory would have gone to hell. And you don't want to know how she screamed. She didn't scream, she shrieked. So much that the workers in the other wing heard her and thought it was the factory siren and stopped working. End quote. To this, Marcos has little to no emotional reaction and simply says it's better to forget these things. But it's clear from these various exchanges that in this world there is little room for empathy or human emotion. People are as dispensable as the animals killed in the slaughterhouse, a commodity that serves little to no function other than to feed something higher up on the food chain. As to his mother, for a woman who supposedly gave a lifetime of devotion to Spanish society, she has become nothing more than a half-page obituary and a ghoulish story shared by her former colleagues. In the original screenplay, the character of Marcos was intended to be much younger, and the story was meant to have centred around a teenage boy, which might have better explained the ever-increasing mess in which the character finds himself. But after jumping through hurdle after hurdle with the censors, Iglesia realised that he would have a much better chance of getting his film made if he cast a well-known actor, someone with a pedigree that the censors might view more favourably. And at the same time, a very well-known actor in Spain became interested in the production, a man who was once called Spain's answer to Clark Gable, and this was the actor Vicente Parra. Parra was born in Valencia in 1931 and from a very young age developed a passion for acting, leading him to appear in numerous amateur stage productions. Leaving the stability of his job at the Bank of Valencia behind him, he travelled to Madrid to try to build an acting career, and here he first appeared in theatre before eventually transitioning into film. He made his screen debut in a minor role in a 1949 movie called Rumbo, and then continued to alternate between film and theatre until 1956, when he starred in a thriller called The Andalusian Express, at which point he put theatre to one side and began to focus solely on cinema. His major success came 2 years later, playing King Alfonso XII of Spain in the historical drama Where Are You Going, Alfonso XII? This was a huge success, and one which was followed 2 years later by a second film called Where Are You Going, Sad One, in which he reprised the character. This was again very successful, leading to the comparisons with Clark Gable, and while it would lead to other films, he also began to find himself becoming increasingly typecast, appearing in roles that didn't challenge him as an actor or provide much room for creativity. But as the 1960s continued, Parra's popularity began to decline, and roles became harder to come by. And while this may, in part, have been down to typecasting, it is also far more likely that there was another reason behind this, one that gives his performance in The Week of the Killer an additional and incredibly tragic resonance. Parra's success caused no small amount of jealousy on the part of his fellow actors, who, it would appear, used every trick in the book to try to discredit him professionally and then win his parts for themselves. And very sadly, and appropriately given the subtext of this week's film, in Parra they found an incredibly easy target, denouncing him behind the scenes because of his sexual orientation. I have to be honest, it is not entirely clear whether Parra was bisexual or gay, but in reality, in the political climate of Francoist Spain, I suppose it doesn't really make much difference. A 2010 documentary titled El Muro Rosa, or The Pink Wall, focused on the oppressions of LGBTQ people under Franco, and the filmmaker Enrico Del Pozo expanded on Parra's story further, saying, quote, "There were those who denounced homosexual colleagues out of envy to steal their roles. One victim was Vicente Parra. People wondered why he wasn't working more after the success of Where Are You Going, Alfonso XII? The profession knows who they are, but I don't want to start a witch hunt." End quote. Parra's friend and colleague, the actress Lola Herrera, also supported this claim, saying in a separate interview that Parra was much envied and criticised, and that his colleagues never forgave him for his success, not even, as she said, many years after he had lost it. To be a gay or bisexual man in Spain of the time was to go against the laws of the Franco government, who had amended legislation meant to deal with vagrants and criminals to include people considered quote-unquote socially dangerous. This meant that LGBTQ people could be arrested and interred, not for any specific crime, just for their identity and perceived sexual behaviour, whether proven or otherwise. There was also the risk of social persecution, family rejection, police brutality, and gay conversion therapies and forced labour camps. It's not surprising, then, that another friend and co-star of Parra's, the actress Fiorello Fortellano, would go on to say of her friend, quote, "He was a man with a complicated personality and a beautiful soul, but he had not been able to accept his homosexuality, and that tormented him. From the outside, he was a heartthrob who charmed women and a great star of film and theatre. But inside, he was like a child caught doing something wrong, always afraid of being discovered." End quote. Eager to work in film again, and also to give his career a new direction, it's no wonder that Parra was interested in working on Iglesia's project, and I've seen many reports saying that he also acted as a producer, though it must be said that some of the information around this is rather contradictory. Regardless, as an important figure in Spanish cinema who had played an important historical figure, his attachment to the project gave it a little more credibility than the director's original plan to cast an unknown 18-year-old. And, as I mentioned, the knowledge of his story certainly gives his performance as the potentially closeted and depressed Marcos an added resonance. All of this, though, makes the film sound far more like a serious drama than it does a horror movie, and while political and social commentary are very much part of the film's DNA, these are woven through a deliberately over-the-top and unrealistic narrative, pushing the film more into the land of the Spanish grotesque as opposed to slice-of-life drama. And it's also incredibly violent, reflecting the director's rage and frustrations with the society of the time. While the initial killing of the taxi driver is relatively tame, as the narrative progresses, the murders become more brutal. Paula is strangled as she and Marcos are kissing. Brother Esteban is clubbed to death with a spanner. Esteban's fiancée, Carmen, has her throat slit, and her father is killed by a meat cleaver to the face, something that we will see again shortly in A Bay of Blood, and something that would also make its way into the first Friday the 13th movie. This is all compounded by the method in which Marcos decides to dispose of the bodies, dismembering the corpses off-screen, and then dropping the pieces into the new machine at work, at which point they are processed and end up in the factory's meat products, which gives an explanation for Iglesia's original title, Genuine Meat Broth. It is also this that presumably led to the English language title of Cannibal Man, prompted by a moment when Marcos, eating in the cafe, begins to wonder exactly what, or indeed who, might be on the end of his fork. This modus operandi also gives explanation to the incredibly brutal slaughter of cows within the factory, which, while shocking, is actually there to make a point. The killings that Marcos commits are, in fact, less brutal than the injustices committed on the livestock, and Iglesias seems to be saying that there is little to no difference between the two. This is even referenced in dialogue towards the end of the film, when Nestor tells Marcos, quote, "Your work in the slaughterhouse is necessary for people like me. We like to eat meat, but not to prepare it. But you should not relate this to humans." End quote. But, analogous or not, these scenes are indeed particularly upsetting, and I have to admit that on every viewing, and there have been multiple this week in preparing this episode, I find myself turning away at these moments every time. The slaughterhouse scenes were used to much different effect in the international release, and were moved from their position in the Spanish version to the opening frames of the film. They even appear before the opening credits, and are no doubt intended as a sensationalist and attention-grabbing stunt to promise viewers the horrors of what is to follow. In addition, this version also removes much of the political subtext, particularly in the scenes with Marcos's boss and co-workers, and this reduces the film to something that is far more shallow and ultimately far more gratuitous. The film would eventually be released in Spain, 64 cuts and all, in 1974, and was marketed with suitably gruesome taglines, which included, quote, "sadistic in its subject matter, brutal in its form, don't watch this film if you are impressionable," end quote, and, quote, "a macabre week of events, you will never forget this film," end quote. Inevitably, it was incredibly polarizing for audiences and also the critics, with negative reviews complaining of the content, as well as the director's, quote, "wearisome obsession with extreme close-ups at the most inappropriate moments," end quote. Still more argued that the narrative and the characters were unrealistic, which, to be fair, is a valid point, but then, as I said earlier, I don't think they were ever really supposed to be. The scenario is deliberately ludicrous and is there to make a point, as opposed to presenting naturalistic reality. Others, though, suggested that the brutality of the images on the screen and the violence of Iglesias' direction had created a new style of filmmaking, a vulgar cinema for a vulgar world, in which he had captured, quote, the fear, disgust, the stench of body decomposition, and the impotence and loneliness of the proletariat, of a man mocked, despised, disregarded, and exploited. End quote. Sadly, though, whichever side of the critical argument you happen to be on, and despite all of the controversies and sensationalist marketing, the film was not a financial success in its homeland. It did, however, do rather better overseas. Shortly after the Spanish release, it was released in the States under two speculative titles, Cannibal Man and Apartment on the 13th Floor, to see which one fared better. Although this was hardly the most scientific of processes, Apartment on the 13th Floor drew in more people, and so the film was retitled this for its wider American release. And this was the title under which it continued to play in the US for many years, including as a double bill with The Living Dead at Manchester Morgue, and rather bizarrely, as the first half of a double bill with the Jean-Luc Godard Rolling Stones documentary, Sympathy for the Devil. Part of its success was also, no doubt, due to a rather misleading marketing campaign, which compared it disingenuously with the 1972 Wes Craven shocker Last House on the Left, though in reality it is probably far closer to Roman Polanski's Repulsion from 1965. But it didn't fare quite so well in England. In the UK, it was released on home video in 1981 under the Cannibal Man title, a decision that, as I mentioned earlier, caused it to be caught up in the video nasties controversy, seemingly based on this title alone. The film was added to the video nasty list in 1983 by the Director of Public Prosecutions, who believed it to have breached the Obscene Publications Act, and there it stayed as one of the quote-unquote DPP 39, a group of films successfully prosecuted or treated as prosecutable rather than merely being liable to seizure. It's been suggested that the title and the opening and out-of-context slaughterhouse scene would have both contributed to this, and that the censors probably got no further into the film before making their decision. As a result, it remained legally unavailable in the UK for many years, only resurfacing in 1993 after 3 seconds of the murder of Carmen were removed. Looking back, all of this seems more than a little ridiculous, especially given that in 2025 the British Board of Film Censors granted the uncut version a 15 certificate, highlighting not just changing social mores, but also how frankly ludicrous the entire video nasties debate really was. Vicente Parra would work with Iglesia once again on his follow-up, the giallo-esque thriller No One Heard the Scream, which is far less violent but still has some political subtext. But much like its predecessor, it was not a great success. Parra's subsequent lack of strong film roles would lead him into other business ventures, including running a nightclub, a furrier shop, and a nursing home in the mountains of Madrid, though none of these were successful. Although he increasingly withdrew from public life, he never abandoned his acting career, and in later years continued to work with great success on the stage and also in television, as well as recording several music albums. He returned to the screen with secondary roles in the black comedy Sights of Spain and Portugal in 1995 and Streetcar to Malvarosa in 1997, which marked his final screen appearance. He passed away from lung cancer on the 2nd of March 1997 at the age of 66. After No One Heard the Scream, Iglesia made one more genre movie, a science fiction film titled Murder in a Blue World, that was heavily influenced by A Clockwork Orange, and in fact was released outside of Spain under the cash-in title Clockwork Terror. This film caused something of an outrage when it was released in Spain, with a letter to the publication Nuevo Fotogramas describing its impact on cinema goers. Quote, "At the end of the showing, there was the most memorable hiss I had ever heard. Patrons were agitated, angry, and hysterical. Their reaction made me realize that the cinema of Eloy de la Iglesia was the most revolutionary thing a director has spat in my face. Violently revolutionary, viciously revolutionary." End quote. Following the death of General Franco on the 20th of November 1975, censorship in Spanish cinema began to change, and Iglesia moved away from genre cinema altogether and started to make far more explicitly political and sexual films. These included El Diputado, about a closeted politician, and El Sacerdote, about a closeted priest, which, even after the death of Franco, were still highly provocative pieces of cinema. After this, he began to explore grittier, urban storylines that dealt with juvenile delinquency and drug addiction, most notably El Pico in 1983 and its follow-up El Pico Due a year later in 1984. Unfortunately, though, it would appear that he engaged himself far too much with the world that he was exploring, and he became addicted to heroin for several years, at which point he stopped making movies altogether. Although he stopped working for 15 years, over this absence his work began to be re-evaluated, and he began to be compared with the likes of Pier Paolo Pasolini and Rainer Werner Fassbinder. In 1996, the San Sebastian Film Festival mounted what was arguably the first major retrospective of his films, titled An Introduction to Eloy de la Iglesia, which was accompanied by a book of the same name. By this time, he had managed to kick his heroin addiction and was incredibly frank about the years and the money he had lost to the drug. A year earlier, in June 1995, he had appeared in a debate on a national TV show, where he admitted, quite frankly, that in less than 3 years he had spent all of his money by, quote, putting it into my veins, end quote. To say that he was happy for the critical re-evaluation would be rather an understatement. Appearing in person at the festival, he thanked the organisers and the audience for remembering that he was alive. In 2001, he wrote and directed an episode of the TV series Estudio 12, and his final film, Bulgarian Lovers, was released in 2003. He died on the 23rd of March 2006, following surgery to remove a malignant tumour caused by kidney cancer. He was 62 years old. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, and we go from one video nasty to another. This is The Ecology of a Crime from 1971, also known as Chain Reaction, A Bay of Blood, Twitch of the Death Nerve, Carnage, and Bloodbath, to name just a few. This stars Luigi Pistilli, Claudine Auger, Claudio Camaso, Laura Betti, and Anna Maria Rosati, and was directed by Mario Bava. We discussed Mario Bava in episode 38 when we talked about his highly influential giallo 6 Women for the Killer, or Blood and Black Lace, and so it seems appropriate to pick up from where we left off. Following Blood and Black Lace, his next film marked a sharp diversion from the haute couture madness of the Christian fashion house, and he stepped into the world of the Western with The Road to Fort Alamo, which was released in 1964. Although it was released in the same year as Sergio Leone's groundbreaking A Fistful of Dollars, this movie was far more conventional. In fact, it has been called one of the director's worst pictures. Far more interesting, though, was the film that came next, which was a collaboration with American International Pictures, and was originally called Terror in Space, although it was retitled Planet of the Vampires for its American release. And this is a very misleading title, as there are actually no vampires in it. A very low-budget production, Bava later said of the experience, quote, I didn't have anything to work with. There was only a studio, completely empty and squalid, because there was no money. I had to turn that into a mysterious alien planet. So what did I do? In the studio next door, there were these 2 big plastic rocks, a leftover prop from a sword and sandal movie or something. I took these 2 rocks and I put them in the middle of my studio. Then I covered the floor with smoke and I darkened the white wall in the background. I shot the whole movie by moving these 2 rocks around the studio. Can you believe it? And while I was shooting, there was this American screenwriter who kept rewriting the script, changing scenes and dialogues, and after a while, I stopped listening to him. End quote. Although the end result is not without its flaws, it is also far better than you might imagine, with a strange, almost Lovecraftian atmosphere and a very interesting twist in the ending. It also, along with It, The Terror from Beyond Space, is one of the many science fiction films that inspired the writer Dan O'Bannon when he began drafting the screenplay for Alien. This film also marked the first film of Bava's son Lamberto, who here worked as a second assistant director, and who would go on to become a director of giallo and horrors himself across the 1980s and beyond. Next came another Western, Savage Gringo, released in 1966, followed by a Nordic adventure called Knives of the Avenger, which reunited Bava with Cameron Mitchell from Blood and Black Lace. After this, Bava returned to the world of Gothic horror with a film that some consider to be his masterpiece, Operazione Paura, or Kill Baby Kill, which was also released in 1966. With very little violence but a sustained atmosphere and, as usual, beautiful cinematography, this tells the story of a small village that is haunted by the spirit of a little girl in white. Bava once said that the film was very much the result of a bet as to whether he could make a movie in 12 days, and with a script that was only 30 pages long, much of the final movie was improvised. The production also ran out of money halfway through, but the cast and crew decided to continue with the project out of respect for the director. Given these adverse conditions, and even more challenges than Planet of the Vampires, it's a miracle the movie got finished at all, let alone being considered Bava's best work, but that is indeed where the film has ended up. At some point we'll probably circle back and discuss that in another episode. As if to prove the old adage from the sublime to the ridiculous, Bava's next movie was Dr. Goldfoot and the Girl Bombs, a film that writer Troy Howarth describes as something that, quote, can charitably be described as a misfire and marks a low point for both Bava and star Vincent Price, end quote. And so, moving very swiftly on, next came 1968's Danger Diabolik, an adaptation of an Italian adult comic book starring John Philip Law in the title role. Even if you haven't seen the movie, you may have seen the iconography, with a leather-clad Law as the titular criminal mastermind Diabolik, in a film that was intended by producer Dino De Laurentiis to act as a companion piece to Barbarella. Interestingly, before the movie was handed to Bava, it was originally intended for the British director Seth Holt, who we discussed back in episode 36. Holt had actually completed the first week of filming much earlier, back in 1965, for a different producer, but that production had been shut down. When it was resurrected by Dino De Laurentiis, he was so appalled by Holt's footage that he went back to the drawing board and hired Bava to direct what would become his first and only multi-million-dollar production. Despite, or perhaps because of this, Bava later said that Danger Diabolik was one of the worst experiences of his life, saying, quote, I was shooting this film for Dino De Laurentiis. It was an important project, and the distributors had paid 1.5 billion lira in advance. But you know De Laurentiis. He is worse than the Ministry of Economy and Finance. The production company made me work for months and months. I, who shot Kill Baby Kill in 12 days. And I wasn't even being paid for working overtime. Moreover, I had little resources at my disposal. The final cost of Diabolik was 200 million lira. I had to come up with all sorts of cheap tricks because the production company didn't give me anything to work with. Did you see Diabolik's house in the countryside, his hideout, his laboratory, the garage? I swear they were all scale models. Photographs that I cut out and pasted on glass in front of the camera, and improvised solutions that allowed me to make up for the misery of the whole scene. And then, after exhausting myself with this kind of work, I also had to direct John Philip Law, who wasn't able to play the bad guy for more than 30 seconds. End quote. Bava was also incredibly frustrated by De Laurentiis' insistence that there should be no violence at all in the movie because he was afraid of censorship, despite the fact that the original comic book source material was as violent as they come. Later, he claimed that when De Laurentiis asked him to direct a sequel, he sent a message saying, quote, "I am ill and permanently confined to bed." End quote. This, though, was clearly a joke, as a year later he worked for De Laurentiis again, not on Diabolik 2, but on The Adventures of Ulysses, a miniseries for which he directed the segment involving the Cyclops, Polyphemus. Next came A Hatchet for the Honeymoon, which was released in 1970, and which follows a fashion designer who happens to be a serial killer. This film opens with a murder on a moving train that, in my opinion at least, acted as the inspiration for the opening of George A. Romero's modern vampire movie Martin from 1977. Although Hatchet for the Honeymoon is often classified as a giallo, many people, myself included, don't really agree with this. There's really no mystery to the film, as the identity of the killer is laid out from the very beginning, and it's probably closer to a psychological portrait of narcissism than it is anything else. It is very enjoyable, though, with a fantastically preening central performance from Stephen Forsyth in the lead role, supported by Laura Betti, who we will see a little later as the nosy Parker neighbour in Bay of Blood. After this came a rather odd erotic comedy called 4 Times That Night, at which point Bava returned to the giallo with 5 dolls for an August moon. Despite the presence of the undisputed queen of Italian gialli, Edwige Fenech, this is not a great film. It's certainly marred by Bava's overuse of zoom effects, especially in the opening moments, and he later himself admitted that it was one of his poorer efforts, saying, quote, "I sometimes get swindled, or I end up shooting movies that are not up to my usual standards. The case of 5 dolls for an August moon is a good example. It went like this. The producers give me a screenplay. I read it and I say I don't like it. It is identical to Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. But the producers insist, and in the end, I accept to direct the film. I tell them that we will discuss the project in detail when they pay me. So I start working on other things, and I forget about the film, until one Saturday morning, the producers call me into their office. They give me my check and my contract, and they tell me that shooting begins on Monday, in 2 days' time. I take the money and I sign the contract, but I tell the producers that the screenplay is no good and that I need at least 10 days to fix the story and make preparations. But no, the shooting begins on Monday. So, in the end, what do I care? The film is done. It's a terrible movie. It's certainly the worst movie among those I directed." End quote. After this rather disappointing experience, he directed a spaghetti western spoof called Roy Colt and Winchester Jack, and also some commercials for the Mobil Oil Company. And then he returned once more to the giallo, and a film which wound up the violence of the genre to such an extent that it would eventually inspire the American slasher movement and at least 2 of the murders in the Friday the 13th franchise. And this, of course, is our second film of the week, A Bay of Blood. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so, as always, please tread with all due caution from here on in. A Bay of Blood is not really the most widely respected of Bava's films, and there are many writers and critics who dismiss it outright as, quote, a sorry shadow of the director's earlier supernatural dramas, end quote. But while it is true that it doesn't have the dreamlike atmosphere or indeed the depth of some of his earlier works, and is definitely the most overtly violent of his movies, I do find it highly enjoyable. And it's also worth mentioning that, despite the views of many film historians, it has also repeatedly been voted as one of the most influential horror films of all time. And this is because, as I mentioned, A Bay of Blood very much anticipates the slasher movie. In fact, it can be seen as the first true slasher picture. But unlike the typical premise of 6 nubile Californians being chased by a man with a machete, this film also contains some very black humour and some wry social commentary about the sheer awfulness of human nature. Overall, it's probably best viewed as a cynical and pitch-black comedy, especially given the tongue-in-cheek poetic justice of the ending, more on which a little bit later. The film came about when producer Dino De Laurentiis, yes, him again, facilitated an introduction between Bava and a screenwriter called Dardano Sacchetti. Sacchetti, who would go on to write films including Lucio Fulci's The Psychic, City of the Living Dead, The Beyond, and The House by the Cemetery, had made his cinematic debut working with Dario Argento on his 1971 giallo, The Cat o' Nine Tails, although the two had had something of a falling out. Sacchetti, then very new to the film industry, had provided Argento with a draft treatment, including several of the ideas that would act as cornerstones for the film, and this was the story that Argento developed with co-writer Luigi Cozzi. A dispute over payment and screen credits caused a rupture between Sacchetti and Argento, something that was amplified even further when the director claimed that the idea for the film had come to him in a fever dream. Sacchetti was angry enough about this to complain publicly, and although he and Argento would work together again on later projects, it's fair to say that it wasn't the smoothest of beginnings for the writer in the Italian film industry. But as one door closed, albeit temporarily, another opened. Hearing of the dispute, De Laurentiis contacted the writer and introduced him to Bava, with the idea that the two could work together on a new giallo. By this time, the giallo, initiated by Bava with 1963's The Girl Who Knew Too Much, had exploded, thanks to the international success of Argento's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. There is certainly little doubt that De Laurentiis was looking to replicate the success of that movie, and the writer and the director hit it off immediately, crafting a screenplay alongside co-writer Franco Barbieri under the working title of That Will Teach Them to Be Bad. Although this title would eventually be abandoned, I have to say it's probably my favourite of all of the titles that are associated with this film, and at least it still turns up in the final Italian version of the story, when it is spoken by two children after they have innocently gunned down their own parents. Although technically speaking the film is a giallo, it does mark a significant departure from the conventions established by Bava and cemented by Argento. Unlike many of its contemporaries, here there is no innocent witness caught up in a murder plot to act as amateur detective. What there is instead is a series of brutal killings, carried out by multiple characters, as each of them tries to gain control over a desirable piece of waterside property that is ripe for redevelopment. The location of the film is also unusual, in that the killings are presented in a rural environment, as opposed to the more usual urban and cosmopolitan settings that had dominated the genre up to this point. And although Lucio Fulci would explore the rural giallo a year later with Don't Torture a Duckling, this is quite possibly the first of the subgenre to truly leave the cities behind. The majority of the film was shot in Sabaudia, which is a small coastal town that was effectively reclaimed from malaria-infested marshes by Mussolini's fascist government of 1933. This project was described by Mussolini as, quote, reclaiming from water and death a great area of territory belonging to the Italian motherland, end quote. And there is no small amount of irony in Bava using the location for his story of competing murderers, offing each other to gain control of the area. But while the location of the film appears to be dense forest land, this was in fact all an optical illusion, as in reality there were only a few trees scattered around the area. The trickery employed by Bava to create this was explained by actress Laura Betti in an interview, saying, quote, all of this had to occur in a forest. But where was it? Bava said, don't worry, I will do the forest. And he found a florist who was selling these stupid little branches with little bits of foliage on them, and he began to make them dance in front of the camera. We had to act the scenes strictly in front of those branches. If we moved even an inch either way, the woods would disappear. End quote. The film opens with a nod to Bava's Gothic roots, as an elderly and wheelchair-bound woman, the Countess Federica Donati, slowly makes her way through her luxurious mansion before meeting a violent and brilliantly choreographed death, as a noose is slipped around her neck and her wheelchair kicked from beneath her. And here, Bava immediately subverts expectations. In most gialli, we would only see the leather-gloved hands of the killer, but here the murderer is revealed almost immediately. It is a very dignified-looking older man, who, it later turns out, is the Countess's husband, Count Filippo Donati. This is certainly a departure from the usual form, and this is amplified even further when the Count himself is then immediately stabbed violently to death by another unseen assailant. Ensuring that the death of the Countess appears to be suicide, the new killer then disposes of Filippo's body in the nearby lake, creating a mystery as to their identity, which, again, unusually for a giallo, is more of a peripheral detail than the central plot mechanism. This double punch opening is highly unusual for gialli of the time, and suggests that Bava was less interested in repeating the form than he was in subverting it, something that becomes all the more apparent as the narrative continues. We are then presented with a number of suspects, including an architect, Ventura, and his girlfriend, Laura, a surly fisherman, baykeeper called Simone, and a rather eccentric couple named Paolo, who is an entomologist, and his wife Anna, a fortune teller, who spends as much time nosing about the neighborhood as she does reading her tarot cards. We also meet Renata and her husband Alberto, who have travelled to the bay with their children to find out what has happened to Renata's father, Count Filippo. Were this to be a traditional giallo, we would assume that this couple would then become the chief detectives. And while the narrative does lead in this direction for a short time, it later transpires that the two of them, and Renata in particular, are equally as capable of killing in order to secure their inheritance. By the end of the movie, all of these characters are killed off, with each murder moving the film away from the conventional Italian whodunit and into a whirlpool of violence, one killing leading to the next in a similar manner to Cannibal Man, albeit in this case committed by different killers. The cast includes some significant players in European cinema. We've already mentioned Laura Betti, who plays Anna, and who had worked with Bava before on a Hatchet for the Honeymoon. But there's also Luigi Pistilli, who starred in the spaghetti western for a few dollars more, as well as the gialli, The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, and the rather ridiculously titled Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. The Countess is played by Issa Miranda, who began her lengthy screen career in 1933, and her husband, the Count, is played by Leopoldo Trieste, who had worked with Fellini and Tinto Brass and Jean-Jacques Annaud, as well as going on to appear as the hotel manager in Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now, as well as playing a role in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather Part 2. And finally, heading up what is essentially an ensemble cast, there is Claudine Auger as the murderous and ruthless Renata, a part that she grabs with both hands, and in which it has to be said she is extremely good. Auger began her career as a model before placing runner-up in the 1958 Miss World Beauty pageant, after which she would be cast by Jean Cocteau in his 1960 movie The Testament of Orpheus. But it was her role as Domino in the 1965 James Bond movie Thunderball that truly launched her European film career. Along with Barbara Boucher and Barbara Bach, she is one of a handful of Bond girls who would also appear in Italian gialli, and the three would actually appear together in The Black Belly of the Tarantula, which was released in the same year as A Bay of Blood, 1971. With 13 murders across its relatively brief runtime, the film might sound like a senseless bloodbath, and it's not surprising that Bloodbath was one of the many titles under which it would eventually be released. But for Sarchetti, there was far more to the idea than just murder after murder after murder, saying in a later interview, quote, "The film is very cohesive because it has a soul. It's simple, but it has a soul. In my screenwriting lessons, I never tire of repeating that first you have to find the film's soul. The soul of Ecology of a Crime lies in the total dissonance between feelings and morality. Parents, for the good of their children and to ensure them a peaceful future, don't hesitate to kill. But the children don't understand this because they want something else, so they kill in turn. It's a dark and gloomy film without hope. There are no good guys, not even the children, and there's no happy ending. That's only for Pretty Woman. But there are large uses of irony to temper the bitterness, hence the splatter. It's the first film to use splatter to soothe the viewer." End quote. Well, I'm not so sure that the murders are soothing, but they are most certainly inventive, with Sacchetti adhering to Bava's request that the film be structured around, quote, "lots of bizarre deaths. He wanted me to invent a staggering number of murders, each different from the next, and each more bizarre than the last." End quote. And this decision was doubtless a reaction to the increasingly violent gialli being produced by Argento and the other directors of his generation, although it has to be said that in this film, Bava outdoes them all. According to Sacchetti, the killings were conceived as isolated set pieces, with initially no real idea as to how they would be strung together. And so we have a hanging, a stabbing, a machete to the face, a decapitation, strangulation, and memorably a couple having sex who are skewered with a giant spear. As I say, I'm not really sure that soothing is the right word, but given that all but two of the victims are pretty reprehensible characters, it's clear that, in this fictional world at least, crime and greed most certainly do not pay. Bava's biographer, Alberto Pizzotta, has described the film as a way for the director to, quote, "express his view of the human race by killing off people who deserve it in the cruelest ways. So there's a moralistic cynicism." End quote. Others have taken this idea a step further and described the film as Marxism, according to Bava, although given that, publicly at least, he remained apolitical throughout his life, this might be reaching more than just a little. Although Sacchetti and Barberi submitted the first draft of the screenplay, a disagreement between Barberi and Bava led to that writer being fired, and Sacchetti then quit as a mark of solidarity. Soon after, Dino De Laurentiis also pulled out of the project, becoming disenchanted with the giallo after the poor international response to Argento's Cat o' Nine Tails. Bava, who by this stage owed a massive amount in back taxes to the Italian government, then approached producer Giuseppe Zaccariello, who not only took on the production but also lent his beachside house in Sabaudia as the filming location. He also insisted that the first draft of the screenplay undergo rewrites by Filippo Ottoni, a first-time screenwriter who was less than thrilled with the assignment as he hated exploitation films, saying, quote, "I told him I wasn't even a fan of detective stories, so I tried writing the story for which the narrative outline had been devised by others. It was a matter of fleshing it out, expanding it a bit, and especially writing the dialogue. I only recently saw the film, and what struck me was the literary, I don't want to say cultured, level of the dialogue. It's spoken by characters who, in my opinion, have nothing to do with the film, and it creates a sort of bizarre effect of alienation. Claudio Volonte, who plays the baykeeper, speaks using subjunctives and absolutely inappropriate adjectives." End quote. This certainly explains the somewhat fragmented nature of the screenplay, something that was compounded by additional insertions by Zaccariello and also by Bava himself during filming. Zaccariello also suggested the title change to Ecology of a Crime, a name that was chosen simply because the word ecology had become fashionable at the time, even though the film has next to nothing to do with the subject. Once the main characters have been introduced, the story takes a rather lengthy segue into what could almost be a different film entirely, and it's this segment that has resulted in the film being seen as the predecessor of the American slasher. 4 teenagers, Luca, Roberto, Sylvie, and Louise, visit the seemingly abandoned property on a double date, and there is a lengthy sequence of the 4 exploring the area and eventually breaking into a house that they think is abandoned. Louise decides to go skinny dipping, where she discovers the submerged body of Filippo, and also attracts the attention of the as-yet undisclosed killer. Running to rejoin the others, she is chased and then killed with a machete, and the remaining trio are also dispatched. Roberto with a machete to the face, and Sylvie and Luca with the aforementioned spear in the film's most notorious and influential sequence. This method of murder, which would be lifted and recreated in 1981's Friday the 13th Part 2, was created by Carlo Rambaldi, who only a few years later would depart for Hollywood, where he would create special effects for Steven Spielberg, including Close Encounters of the Third Kind and the cute little alien of E.T., the extraterrestrial. So, quite a change. He also created the other killings in the film, many of which would also appear in the Friday the 13th series, including Roberto's machete to the face and the center screen decapitation of Anna, which, unlike some of the other killings, has today dated rather badly and may raise more of a laugh than it does abject horror. Sean Cunningham, the director of Friday the 13th, has always denied seeing this film before he made his picture, and while that may or may not be true, in my opinion, the first Friday movie at least has far more in common with this film than it does with Halloween, the film that it is most often accused of copying. And if you watch the two films back to back, with their woodland settings, subjective camera work, and methods of murder, it is rather difficult to believe that the influence isn't there somewhere. As Troy Howarth points out in his book, The Haunted World of Mario Bava, Twitch of the Death Nerve, as it was called in the US, quote, was picked up by Cunningham's distribution company Hallmark and was released in some areas under the title The Last House on the Left Part 2, in an obvious attempt to cash in on the success of Wes Craven's Last House on the Left, the film that Cunningham had produced. End quote. Now, whether you believe Cunningham or not is entirely up to you, and I certainly hesitate to call Friday the 13th an out-and-out rip-off. But it has to be said, the similarities are really quite astounding. One key difference, of course, is in the reveal of the main killer, who, unlike in Cunningham's movie, is not quickly shoehorned in by the introduction of a hitherto unintroduced character, but who has instead been in front of us the whole time. And to be fair to Bava, while the murder mystery might, on the whole, take second place to the mayhem, after the killing of the 4 teenagers, he does at least sprinkle in enough clues and red herrings to keep the audience guessing. Admittedly, it's not the level of intricacy that might have kept Agatha Christie awake at night, but it's entertaining to try to guess the murderer nonetheless. There is also the characterization, which is far more interesting than Cunningham's movie and also has far more depth. The entomologist Paolo is very likeable, if rather weak, and it's very sad to see him killed off, while his wife Anna presents some highly comedic moments, even as she essentially causes both her and her husband's demise through her snooping. Most interesting of all is the dynamic between Renata and Alberto, who start off as a relatively ordinary couple before the lure of a potential fortune leads them into continuing the chain of killing. Though, it has to be said, this decision is very much dictated by Renata, who becomes almost a Lady Macbeth in the way that she pushes her rather weak-willed husband to murder. And then, of course, there is the ending, where Alberto and Renata are shot dead by their children, seemingly as part of an innocent game, but which may also indicate genuine psychopathic tendencies. This is perhaps most clearly suggested in the Italian version, when the daughter suggests that they deserve their fate for being bad, something that was toned down in some of the other versions, when the line was changed to the far more innocent and childlike, quote, "They're very good at playing dead, aren't they?" End quote. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point that the young daughter is played by child actor Nicoletta Elmi, who would go on to work as a performer in multiple Italian gialli and horror films, including Who Saw Her Die in 1972, Flesh for Frankenstein in 1973, Deep Red in 1975, and then, as an adult, in the brilliantly bonkers splatterfest Demons in 1985. Ecologia of a Crime opened in Italy in September 1971, but it was not particularly successful, being first withdrawn and then retitled as Chain Reaction for a re-release in 1972. Not that this made a huge difference, as in Italy, like with much of Bava's other work, it didn't do particularly well, either commercially or critically, under either title. In 1973, it was entered into competition at the Ovarias Fantastic Film Festival, an event which led to an interesting, oft-repeated, but possibly apocryphal story. It's been reported by multiple writers that Christopher Lee, who had worked with Bava before, had been eager to see the director's latest film at the festival, but was so revolted by the levels of violence that he walked out in disgust. This has been reported as fact by some and as rumour by others, and so is probably safer to say that this is an interesting anecdote rather than the gospel truth. Nevertheless, the violence was certainly a contributing factor to the film being refused a cinema certificate in the UK in 1972, and it would only become available in England in 1983, when it was released on home video under the title Bloodbath. At this point, it was pretty much immediately swept up in the UK video nasties debacle, when it was added, along with Cannibal Man, to the notorious DPP-39. And much like Cannibal Man, it also fared much better commercially in the States, where it was initially released in 1972 under the oh-so-subtle title of Carnage. For this release, the distributors proclaimed that it was the second film rated V for violence, which was not entirely true, and this resulted in a lawsuit from the Motion Picture Association of America on the grounds that only they had the right to rate motion pictures. The film was then withdrawn and re-released under the title Twitch of the Death Nerve, where it played for years in drive-ins and grindhouses as part of double or triple bills, including, as I mentioned, with Wes Craven's Last House on the Left. In later years, it would undergo other retitling in the States, including A Bay of Blood, Last House on the Left Part 2, Last House Part 2, and New House on the Left, demonstrating not only the notoriety of Wes Craven's debut feature, but also a complete lack of imagination on the part of distributors. Since its release, the controversy regarding the film has continued, and critical opinion has been extremely divided. For some, including the magazine Cinefantastique, it is, quote, the director's most complete failure to date, end quote, while for others it is seen as the most influential of Bava's career. People have called it one of the most imitated horror movies of the 1970s, and also, quote, the acknowledged smoking gun behind the body count phenomena of the 1980s, end quote. Personally, I think it has a lot more going for it than many of the movies that fit into that category, but given my preference for Italian genre cinema in general, and the works of Mario Bava in particular, there's no doubt that my opinion is rather biased. We're going to be revisiting Bava again later in the series, and so we're going to leave his career here for the moment, but we will be picking up from where we're leaving off in a few months' time. As for A Bay of Blood, Twitch of the Death Nerve, or whatever you might want to call it, it may lack the finesse and the style of some of his earlier films, particularly with its overuse of zoom photography, but with its cynicism about human nature, commitment to the contagious nature of violence, and general mean-spiritedness, it's a film that I can happily return to time and time again. Cannibal Man and A Bay of Blood are both, of course, films that were classed as video nasties by the British government, a decision that led to them becoming increasingly hard to watch in the UK for many years. Even though they are extremely violent for their period, watching them now, it's rather hard to see what all the fuss was about. But given we live in a world of Terrifier movies, and where opening TikTok seems tantamount to watching any number of homemade snuff films, perhaps the 1980s was just a much more innocent time. But more than their violence, both films do have a deeper subtext, deliberately political on the part of Cannibal Man, and possibly inferred on the part of the audience with A Bay of Blood. As a double bill, They combine to give an incredibly cynical and very dark-humoured view of human nature, and also the self-perpetuating nature of violence, a message that seems even more relevant today, as it was when they were made over half a century ago. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please also consider sharing this episode with any horror-loving friends. Just as a reminder, you can contact the show via email at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow our Instagram at thehorrordouble. Next week, we move away from the violence of humanity and explore rather more shapeless horrors, the first from within the earth and the second from outer space. First, we will be discussing X the Unknown from Hammer Studios and 1956. This stars Dean Jagger, Leo McKern and Edward Chapman and was directed by Leslie Norman. And then we follow this with one of the great horror remakes of the 1980s, The Blob from 1988 and director Chuck Russell. This stars Kevin Dillon, Shawnee Smith, Donovan Leitch and Candy Clark. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting Just Watch. And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.